Somewhere in the far north, 20,000 years ago, in a cold so deep that the air itself seems to have frozen solid, a shape is moving through the dark. It is enormous, taller at the shoulder than a large man, and far heavier than any animal you have ever stood beside. It is covered, from the top of its high domed head to the ground, in a thick hanging coat of dark hair, and beneath that coat is a second layer of dense wool, and beneath that a layer of fat, and together they hold in a warmth that the wind, screaming across 1,000 kilometers of open frozen grassland, cannot reach. Two great curving tusks sweep out ahead of it, and it swings them low, sweeping the snow aside to reach the frozen grass beneath. It is not cold. That is the strange thing. In a world that would kill you in minutes, in a night so cold it would stop your heart, the animal is warm and calm and unhurried, moving through the blizzard as though through a summer field. It was built for this. Its whole body, every hair and every gram of fat, is an answer to the cold. This is its world, and it is the largest and most successful animal in it. It is a woolly mammoth, and the frozen grassland it is crossing stretches, almost unbroken, from the western edge of Europe across the whole of northern Asia and over a vanished land bridge into North America. The single largest ecosystem on the face of the earth. Millions of animals live on it, and in 10,000 years, almost every one of them will be gone, and the grassland itself will be gone, and this whole world. The largest, coldest, richest version of the planet in the last million years will have melted into memory. Tonight, we are going to spend some time in that world while it is still frozen and still full. Welcome to Lost Ages. Over the next few hours, we're going to walk out into the last ice age. Not the deep prehistoric past of the earlier journeys, not the age of dinosaurs or the ancient seas, but a world far closer to our own. A world that human beings actually lived in. A world cold enough to freeze an ocean into the land, and rich enough to feed herds of giants, and strange enough that almost nothing in it survives today. We'll walk out onto the Mammoth steppe, the vast frozen grassland that has no equivalent anywhere on Earth now, and that once stretched around most of the northern world. We'll meet the animals that lived on it, the woolly mammoth and the woolly rhinoceros, the great bison herds, the cave lions and the sabre-toothed cats, the cave bears sleeping through the long winters, the dire wolves, and further south, the truly strange giants. Ground sloths the size of elephants, armored animals the size of small cars. We'll meet the people who lived alongside them, in the cold, by firelight, and who left us their hands pressed onto the walls of caves. And we'll watch, at the end, as the world warms, and the ice pulls back, and almost all of it vanishes. Before we go out into the snow, two small things. If you find something here worth staying for, a like helps more than you'd think. And if these are the kind of journeys you'd like more of, you're welcome to follow along. And there's one thing I always like to know. In the comments, tell me where you're listening from, your city, and what time it is there right now. These recordings travel a great deal further than I ever expect them to, and I like knowing which part of the world has gone dark and cold while this one is playing. Before we go out onto the ice, it's worth being clear about what we mean by the Ice Age, because the phrase hides a more interesting truth. We speak of the Ice Age as if it were a single event, one long cold spell that came and went. But the reality is that the Earth has been in an Ice Age, in the technical sense, for the last 2.5 million years, and still is. An Ice Age, properly speaking, is any period in which there is permanent ice at the poles. And there is permanent ice at the poles right now on Greenland and Antarctica. We are living in an Ice Age. We just happen to be living in one of its warm phases. Because within that long, cold era, the climate has swung back and forth, over and over, between colder phases and warmer ones. The colder phases are called glacials, the true deep freezes when the ice sheets spread and the mammoth steppe opened up. The warmer phases, like the one we live in now, are called interglacials, the mild spells between the freezes when the ice pulls back to the poles and the forests return. And this has happened not once but many times. A long, slow, rhythmic pulse of cold and warmth, glacial and interglacial, repeating roughly every 100,000 years, driven by those subtle regular changes in the Earth's orbit and tilt. So the frozen world we're visiting tonight, the world of the mammoths and the cave painters, was the most recent glacial phase, which reached its coldest around 20,000 years ago. But it was only the latest of many. The mammoth steppe had opened and closed many times before, expanding in the cold phases, shrinking in the warm ones, a great grassland that breathed in and out across hundreds of thousands of years, in time with the pulse of the ice. The animals we're about to meet had ridden that pulse for a very long time. They had survived many warmings before. The mammoths and the rhinos and the lions had seen interglacials come and go, their grassland shrinking and returning again and again across hundreds of thousands of years. This is part of what makes their final disappearance so striking. They had weathered the warm phases before. Something about the last one, the speed of it, perhaps, or what came with it, was different. And this time, when the ice pulled back, the giants did not return with the next freeze. This time, the warming was the end. Now, let the room grow warm and heavy around you. Let the day you've finished, everything it asked of you, everything it took, settle away somewhere behind you where it can wait until the morning. We're going out into the cold, but you'll be warm the whole time. You can watch the frozen world from somewhere safe and heavy, and still, the way you'd watch a blizzard from inside a warm room with the fire lit. The snow is falling. The great animals are moving through it. Let yourself go out to meet them. To understand the last ice age, the first thing you have to let go of is the idea that it was simply a colder version of the world we have now. It was a different world. Different coastlines, different rivers, different amounts of land and sea, a different sky. If you were set down in it, even in a place you knew well, you would not recognize it. Start with the ice itself, because everything else follows from it. At the height of the last glaciation, around 20,000 years ago, a period scientists call the last glacial maximum. Enormous sheets of ice lay over the northern parts of the world. Not glaciers in the sense of the alpine ice rivers we have now, but continental ice sheets, single masses of ice, thousands of kilometers across and, in places, more than 3 kilometers thick. One of them lay over almost all of what is now Canada and reached down into the northern United States, burying the sites of future cities under a mass of ice taller than any mountain most people will ever see. Another lay over Scandinavia and northern Britain and pushed out across northern Europe. A third capped the mountains and highlands of northern Asia. Think about 3 kilometers of ice. The weight of it was so great that it physically pushed the crust of the earth downward, pressing the land into the mantle beneath. And in some places, 10,000 years after the ice melted, the land is still slowly rising back up, still rebounding from a weight that has been gone for 100 centuries. The ice bent the planet. That is how much of it there was. And all of that ice came from somewhere. It came from the sea. Here is the fact that reshapes everything, and it's worth holding on to because it changes the map of the world. The water locked up in those ice sheets had to come from the ocean because there is nowhere else on Earth to get that much water. Snow falls on the land, compresses into ice, and does not melt and return to the sea. So year after year, century after century, water is taken out of the ocean and stacked up on the continents as ice. And as that happens, the sea level falls. At the height of the last ice age, the sea stood around 120 meters lower than it does today. 120 meters. That is not a small adjustment to the coastline. It is a redrawing of the map of the world. Vast areas that are now seabed were dry land. Britain was not an island. You could have walked from France to England across a broad plain, now drowned beneath the North Sea, that was once rich hunting ground, and from which fishing boats still occasionally dredge up the bones of mammoths. Asia and North America were joined, where the Bering Strait is now, by a wide land bridge. Not a narrow causeway, but a subcontinent in its own right, 1,000 kilometers from north to south, dry and cold and grassy, across which animals and, eventually, people walked from one hemisphere to the other. The islands of Southeast Asia were joined to the mainland. Vast shallow seas were open plains. If you could see the Ice Age Earth from space, the shape of the continents would be subtly, disorientingly wrong. The land would be larger, the seas smaller, the familiar outlines swollen and connected in unfamiliar ways, and across the northern third of that enlarged, connected land. From the drowned plains of the North Sea, across all of northern Europe and Asia, over the land bridge, and into the heart of North America, stretched something that does not exist anywhere on the planet today. A single, vast, cold grassland. The mammoth steppe. The climate of that world was not only colder, it was drier and windier, and in a strange way, sunnier, and all of that mattered. The enormous ice sheets changed the way air moved across the planet. They pushed the weather systems around, dried out the air, and generated fierce, persistent, cold winds that blew off the ice and across the land beyond it. The world was, on average, perhaps 5 or 6 degrees colder than today, which does not sound like much until you understand that this is a global average and that the changes were concentrated and amplified in ways that transformed whole continents. And carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was low, much lower than today, which had a consequence that reaches right up into the ecosystem we're about to walk through. Low carbon dioxide, combined with the cold and the dryness, favored grasses over trees. Forests retreated. Grasslands spread. The world became, across enormous areas, an open landscape. Not the tundra of the modern far north, which is soggy and mossy and boggy, but something drier, harder, and far more productive. A cold, dry, grassy plain, swept by wind, grazed by millions of animals, stretching further than the eye could follow in any direction. That open, grassy, productive quality is the key to everything. Because a world of grass is a world that can feed grazers, and a world that can feed grazers can feed the things that eat grazers, and so the cold, dry, windy Ice Age Earth, which sounds so hostile, was in fact able to support one of the richest communities of large animals the planet has ever known. Not despite the cold. Because of what the cold did to the land. We tend to imagine the Ice Age as a frozen wasteland, white, empty, dead. It was the opposite. It was one of the most crowded landscapes in the history of the world. And to understand how that was possible, we need to walk out onto the grassland itself and understand the strange, vanished ecosystem that fed it all. It is worth pausing on how we know all this, because the frozen world has left us an unusually rich record, and the ways we read it are worth understanding. There are the bones, of course. the ordinary stuff of paleontology, dug from ancient riverbeds and caves and tar pits, telling us the shapes and sizes of the animals. But the Ice Age gives us far more than bones, because it is so recent and because so much of it happened in the cold and cold preserves. There is the permafrost, the permanently frozen ground of the far north, which we've already touched on, and which holds whole animals, flesh and hair and stomach contents intact, a natural deep freeze that has kept its specimens for tens of thousands of years. Nowhere else in the fossil record is anything like it. We do not have the flesh of a dinosaur or an ichthyosaur. We have the flesh of a mammoth. The Ice Age is the one lost world we can, in places, still touch. There are the caves, not just the painted ones, but caves that acted as natural traps and shelters, accumulating the bones of the animals that died in them across tens of thousands of years, layer upon layer, a stratified record of what lived in the surrounding land and when. There are the tar pits, where asphalt seeping to the surface trapped and preserved animals in enormous numbers, giving us dense samples of whole predator and prey communities. And there is the ice itself, the great ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica, which built up snow layer by layer, year by year, across hundreds of thousands of years, trapping in each layer a tiny sample of the ancient atmosphere. Drill down into that ice, extract a core, and you can read the climate of the past directly. The temperature of each year, the amount of carbon dioxide in the air, the dust and ash of distant events. Going back hundreds of thousands of years, layer by layer, like the rings of a tree. The ice remembers the weather of the Ice Age, and we have learned to read it. Put it all together. The bones, the frozen bodies, the caves, the tar pits, the ice cores, and the paintings left by the people who were there. And the frozen world comes to us in more detail and more vividly than any other lost world in this whole series. We can reconstruct not just the animals, but the climate. Not just the climate, but the daily weather. Not just the weather, but the view from inside a human mind, 20,000 years ago, looking at a mammoth and reaching for a way to draw it. There is a lost ecosystem at the heart of this story, and it is worth understanding on its own terms, because it is genuinely gone. Not reduced, not relocated, but vanished from the earth entirely, with no true equivalent surviving anywhere. It was called the Mammoth steppe, and for tens of thousands of years it was the largest single ecosystem on the planet. Picture a grassland, but not a modern grassland, not the tall grass prairie, not the African savanna, not the soggy tundra of the modern Arctic. Picture something that combined the best features of the richest grasslands with a cold, dry, continental climate and spread it across the entire top of the world. It ran, at its greatest extent, from the plains of what is now Western Europe, eastward across the whole breadth of Russia and Siberia, over the Bering Land Bridge, and into Alaska and the Yukon. A single continuous belt of cold, dry grassland wrapping most of the way around the northern hemisphere, thousands of kilometers wide in places, and stretching most of the way around the globe. Nothing like it exists today. It is one of the strangest facts of the recent past that the single biggest ecosystem on Earth, only 20,000 years ago, is one that no living person has ever seen. And it was astonishingly productive. This is the part that surprises people, because we associate cold with barrenness. But the Mammoth steppe was not barren. It was a grazing ground of extraordinary richness, dry enough that the ground was firm rather than boggy, grassy enough to feed enormous herds, and productive enough to support a community of large animals whose density and variety rivaled, and by some measures exceeded, the great animal herds of the African plains today. Why was it so rich? The answer is a beautiful piece of ecology, and it involves the animals themselves. The mammoth steppe was not simply a landscape that happened to have animals on it. The animals made the landscape, and the landscape made the animals in a loop that fed itself. This is the idea developed by scientists studying the frozen soils of Siberia, of the steppe as a kind of self-sustaining engine. And it works like this. Grasses grow fast and are quickly grazed, and the grazing itself keeps the grassland healthy. When millions of large herbivores crop the grass, trample the moss and shrubs that would otherwise take over, fertilize the soil with their dung, and churn the ground with their feet, they keep the land open, dry, and grassy. The grazing prevents the wet, mossy, boggy tundra vegetation from establishing itself. It keeps the productive grasses dominant, and the productive grasses feed still more grazers. The animals maintained the very grassland that fed them. A mammoth alone eats enormous quantities of grass every day and returns it to the soil as dung, fertilizing the ground. A herd of them, plus the bison and the horses and the rhinoceroses and the deer, cropping and trampling and fertilizing across millions of square kilometers, actively maintained a dry, grassy, productive landscape that would otherwise have reverted to something poorer. The mammoth steppe was, in a real sense, gardened by its own inhabitants. It was a grassland held in place by the animals that lived on it. This matters enormously for the end of the story, because it means the ecosystem was fragile in a particular way. Remove the animals, and you don't just lose the animals. You lose the mechanism that maintained the grassland. The garden, untended, reverts. And that is part of what happened when the world warmed and the great grazers began to disappear. The steppe that had fed them, no longer maintained by them, turned to wet tundra and forest, and the loss of the land and the loss of the animals accelerated each other, each making the other worse. But that is the ending. For now, we are in the middle of it, the frozen world at its height, the grassland vast and open and full, the millions of animals moving across it, maintaining it, fed by it. Let's meet them, starting with the animal the whole ecosystem is named for. There is a final thing worth understanding about the frozen world, and it concerns why the animals were so large. Because Ice Age gigantism is a real pattern, and it has real causes, and they illuminate the whole age. Again and again, in the cold, animals grew large. The mammoth, the rhino, the giant deer, the cave bear, the ground sloth, the great cats. The Ice Age was an age of giants, of animals notably larger than their relatives in warmer times and warmer places. And this is not an accident. Large size and cold go together for reasons that come down to simple physics. A large body holds heat better than a small one. As an animal gets bigger, its volume, which generates and holds heat, grows faster than its surface area, which loses heat. So a large animal has proportionally less surface through which to lose warmth relative to the mass that produces it, and stays warm more easily in the cold. This is a real and general rule. In cold climates, within a given group of animals, the larger forms tend to do better, and animals tend to evolve toward larger size. The cold selects for bigness, and the rich grassland made the bigness possible. It is one thing to benefit from large size. It is another to be able to afford it, because a large animal needs a great deal of food. The mammoth steppe, with its enormous productivity, its endless grass, could feed giants, could provide the vast quantities of food that a 6-ton mammoth or a several-ton ground sloth required. The cold made bigness advantageous. The rich grassland made it affordable. Together, they produced an age of giants. So the frozen world was not incidentally full of large animals. It was an age of giants for deep and understandable reasons. The cold favoring size, the grassland feeding it. And when both of those conditions ended, when the world warmed and the grassland broke apart, the age of giants ended with them. The giants had been a response to a particular world, the cold, rich, grassy world of the mammoth steppe. And when that world dissolved, the response dissolved with it. The giants were not a permanent feature of the earth. They were the shape life took in one particular cold and grassy age, and when the age ended, so did they. Everyone knows the woolly mammoth, or thinks they do, and the reality is both more familiar and stranger than the cartoon. Start with the basics, because they matter. A woolly mammoth was not much larger than a modern elephant. The popular image of a titanic beast is a little exaggerated. A large male stood perhaps 3 meters at the shoulder, comparable to a large African elephant, though more heavily built. What made it a mammoth rather than an elephant was not its size, but everything the cold had done to it, and the cold had done a great deal. The coat first. A mammoth was covered in 2 layers of hair, a long outer coat of coarse guard hairs, up to a metre long on the flanks and belly, hanging down like a skirt almost to the ground, and beneath it a dense, soft, woolly undercoat that trapped a layer of warm air against the skin. Beneath the skin lay a layer of fat up to 10 centimeters thick. The combination made the animal almost perfectly insulated. So well insulated that, like the mammoth in our opening, it could stand in a killing blizzard and remain warm. Then the details, each one an adaptation to the cold. The ears were small, far smaller than an African elephant's great heat-shedding fans, because in the cold you do not want to shed heat, and large ears would simply freeze. The tail was short for the same reason. The trunk had a specialized tip, adapted for grasping grass and, some think, for sweeping snow. There was a high, domed head and a distinctive hump of fat over the shoulders, a fuel reserve for the long, hard winters. Even the anus, it is thought, had a flap of skin to close it against the cold. The adaptation to the cold reached into every part of the body, down to details we would never think of. And the tusks. Mammoth tusks were enormous and dramatically curved, sweeping out, then curving in and up, sometimes crossing over each other at the tips in old males. They could reach 4 meters in length along the curve. They were used, as far as we can tell, for display, for combat between males, and practically for sweeping snow off the frozen grass to reach the food beneath. A mammoth's tusk grew throughout its life, in annual layers, like a tree. And like a tree, it can be read. Cut across a mammoth tusk, and you can count its years, and read in the thickness and chemistry of each layer the seasons of the animal's life. The good years and the hard ones, the season it was weaned, the times of stress, sometimes even, in a female, the years she gave birth. We know an extraordinary amount about these animals, and the reason is unique in all of paleontology. We have their bodies, not their bones, their bodies. In the frozen ground of Siberia and Alaska, the permafrost, mammoths that died and were buried in the cold have been preserved, flesh and hair and organs and all, for tens of thousands of years. From time to time, the frozen ground gives one up, a whole mammoth, or part of one, thawing out of a riverbank or a melting slope, as fresh in some cases as an animal dead a few months rather than a few hundred centuries. There is a baby mammoth, a female calf, found in the Siberian permafrost, so perfectly preserved that her skin, her trunk, her tiny eyes, the milk still in her stomach, all survived. She was about a month old when she died, around 40,000 years ago, probably drowned or trapped in mud, and the fine sediment and the cold held her, complete, across all that time. We know what she ate. We know she had suckled from her mother that day. We know the shape of her trunk and the folds of her skin. She is, in every meaningful sense, a mammoth we can look at. Not a reconstruction, not a skeleton, but the animal itself, 40,000 years old, thawed back into the light. There are adults too, some with their last meal still in their stomachs. Frozen grass, buttercups, sedges, the specific plants of a specific summer day tens of thousands of years ago, eaten hours before the animal died. We know the mammoth steppe was grassy and flowery in summer, partly because we have read it out of the stomachs of the animals that grazed it. The frozen world kept its own record in the bodies of its own dead and handed it to us intact. This is why the mammoth, of all extinct animals, feels so close. Most vanished animals are bones and inference. The mammoth is flesh. We have held its wool in our hands. We have looked into the preserved face of a mammoth calf. It died 40,000 years ago, and it is still, somehow, here. The life of a mammoth, as far as we can reconstruct it, was much like the life of a modern elephant, shaped to the cold. They lived in herds, and those herds were led by females. The matriarch structure of modern elephants, where a group of related females and their young is led by the oldest and most experienced female, whose memory holds the knowledge the herd depends on. Where the water is, where the good grazing lies, where the safe crossings are, the routes and the dangers learned over decades. In a world as harsh and as vast as the mammoth steppe, that accumulated knowledge was the difference between life and death, and it lived in the mind of the old female at the head of the herd. The males, as in modern elephants, most likely lived apart, alone or in loose bachelor groups, joining the female herds only to breed. The combat between males, tusk against tusk, could be ferocious. There are mammoth skeletons found with tusks locked together. Two males who fought became inextricably tangled and died together, unable to separate, preserved in the position of their final struggle. The young were born after a long pregnancy, cared for intensely, and raised slowly, as elephant calves are. Protected at the center of the herd, taught the roots and the knowledge, dependent on their mothers for years. A mammoth was a slow-breeding, long-lived, intelligent, social animal, and that combination, which served it so well in a stable world, would prove to be part of its undoing when the world changed too fast for a slow-breeding animal to adapt. But for now, picture the herds. Across the vast open grassland, in the thin, cold sunshine, herds of mammoths moving slowly over the plain, the matriarchs leading, the calves close, the great curved tusks sweeping the snow, the long coats swaying. Hundreds of thousands of them spread across the top of the world, the largest animals of the largest ecosystem on Earth. That is the frozen world at its height, and they were not alone on it. There is a broader lesson hiding in the mammoth's fate, and it runs underneath this whole story, so it's worth naming clearly now, because you'll feel it again at the end. The mammoth was superbly adapted, one of the most perfectly cold-adapted animals the world has ever produced. Every part of it, from the tiny ears to the fat hump to the flap of skin over the anus, was a precise answer to the cold. It was the master of its world, the largest and most successful animal in the largest ecosystem on Earth. And that mastery was a kind of trap. Because to be that perfectly adapted to the cold, dry, grassy world of the mammoth steppe was to be helpless in any other world. Every adaptation that made the mammoth supreme on the frozen grassland, the enormous coat, the fat, the specialization for grazing dry grass in cold conditions, became a liability the moment the world warmed and the grassland turned to bog and forest. A mammoth cannot shed its adaptations. It cannot become a forest animal. It is built, down to the last detail, for a world that was ceasing to exist, and it had nowhere to go. We've seen this pattern in the earlier journeys, in the ancient seas. The exquisitely specialized animals that ruled the rich, stable world and then died when the world changed, while the unspecialized generalists rode it out and inherited the ruins. Here it is again, on land, in the recent past. The mammoth, the master of the frozen world, gone. The wolf and the horse and the reindeer. Less specialized, more flexible, able to live in more than one kind of world, survived. Being the best adapted animal in the world is a wonderful thing to be, right up until the world changes, at which point it becomes the most dangerous thing to be. There is something worth holding in that, quietly, as you rest. It is not strength that survives the great changes. It is not mastery or perfection or dominance. It is flexibility, the capacity to be something other than what you are, to live in more than one world. The animals that could only do one thing, however superbly, fell. The animals that could do many things, however modestly, came through. The meek, in the most literal sense, inherited the earth. Not because they were better, but because they were less committed to a world that would not last. There is one more thing about the mammoths themselves worth adding, because it makes them feel less like specimens and more like the intelligent, social, feeling animals they were. We know, from their closest living relatives, the elephants, what kind of animal a mammoth most likely was on the inside. And it was not a dumb beast. Elephants are among the most intelligent animals on Earth. They have extraordinary memories, complex social lives, and something that looks very much like grief. They recognize the bones of their dead and return to them and handle them and stand over them in what can only be described as mourning. They comfort one another in distress. They cooperate and remember individuals across decades and pass knowledge down through the generations in the mind of the matriarch. There is every reason to think the mammoth was the same. A mammoth herd was not just a group of animals. It was a society, bound by memory and relationship, led by an old female whose mind held the accumulated wisdom of decades. The roots, the water, the dangers, the knowledge that kept them alive. The calves were raised with care over many years. The bonds between them were, in all likelihood, deep and lasting. And if elephants grieve, then mammoths very likely grieved too, stood over their dead in the snow and remembered them and felt the loss. This changes how you should picture the end. The great dying of the mammoths was not just the loss of a species in the abstract way we might think of a statistic. It was the loss of countless individual animals, each embedded in a society, each known to others, each with a life and a place and relationships. Somewhere near the end, there were last herds. Small, dwindling groups of intelligent, social, remembering animals, led by old matriarchs whose inherited knowledge could no longer save them, moving across a landscape that was ceasing to be able to feed them, growing smaller and fewer until there were not enough left to go on. I don't say this to make the ending sadder than it needs to be, but it is worth remembering, when we speak of the extinction of the mammoth, that we are not speaking only of a species vanishing from a chart. We are speaking of the last of a long line of intelligent, social, feeling animals. Animals that remembered and mourned and knew one another, coming quietly to an end, herd by herd, in a warming world, until the very last of them stood alone. The frozen world's greatest animal was also, very likely, one of its most feeling ones, and it deserves to be remembered as more than a giant. It was a person of a kind, and then it was gone. The mammoth shared its grassland with a whole community of large grazers, and each of them was a variation on the same theme: a big, cold-adapted plant-eater, built to convert the endless grass of the steppe into flesh and to survive a winter that would kill almost anything unprepared. The most spectacular of the mammoth's companions was the woolly rhinoceros, and it deserves to be as famous as the mammoth, because it was every bit as strange and every bit as perfectly built for the cold. Picture a rhinoceros, but covered, like the mammoth, in a thick, shaggy coat of reddish-brown hair, with small ears and a stocky, low-slung, heavily insulated body. It had 2 horns, one behind the other, and the front one was enormous. Long, flattened from side to side rather than round, and swept forward. That flattened front horn shows distinctive wear on its front surface, and the best explanation is that the animal used it as a snowplow, sweeping it side to side across the frozen ground to clear the snow and expose the grass beneath. The same problem the mammoth solved with its tusks, solved differently by the rhino with its horn. We know the woolly rhinoceros as intimately as the mammoth, and for the same reason, the frozen ground has given us its body. There are woolly rhinos thawed out of the Siberian permafrost, complete with their hair, their skin, and in one remarkable case, a young rhino so well preserved that even its soft tissues and the contents of its gut survived. We know its color, its coat, its diet. It was a grazer of the open steppe, its head held low, cropping the grass, built close to the ground and heavily furred, moving across the plain among the mammoths and the bison and the horses. And there were the horses. This surprises people, because we think of horses as animals of warm plains and of human domestication. But wild horses were among the most abundant and successful animals of the Ice Age steppe. They were built for it, hardy, fast, able to travel long distances to find grazing, able to paw through snow to reach the grass beneath. They moved across the mammoth steppe in great herds, one of the staple grazers of the whole ecosystem and one of the staple prey animals for its predators. The horses of the Ice Age steppe were the ancestors, in part, of the horses we know. And where the steppe survived longest, so did they. There were bison. Great herds of them, larger than the bison of today, with enormous sweeping horns, moving across the grassland in numbers that echo the vast bison herds that would later cover the North American plains. The steppe bison was one of the most abundant large animals of the whole ecosystem and one of the most important prey species. Like the mammoth and the rhino, some have been found frozen in the permafrost, complete enough that we know their color and their build. One famous frozen bison, thawed from the Alaskan permafrost, was preserved so well that the marks of the lion claws that killed it could still be read on its hide. Let me add one more animal to the northern grasslands, because it was one of the most important of all, and it is easy to overlook among the giants: the steppe bison and the great herds it moved in. The bison of the Ice Age was larger than the bison we know, with a greater span of horn. A massive, powerful grazer that moved across the mammoth steppe in enormous herds, one of the most abundant large animals of the whole ecosystem. Where the mammoth was the giant and the rhino was the specialist, the bison was the multitude, the staple grazer, present in vast numbers, the animal that more than any other filled the plain with moving life. And because it was so abundant, the bison was central to the whole community. It was the main prey of many of the great predators: the cave lions, the wolves, the sabre-tooths of the Americas all depended heavily on bison herds. And it was central to the human beings too. Bison were among the most important game animals of the Ice Age hunters, providing meat and hides in reliable abundance, hunted at the river crossings and driven, in some places, over cliffs in great coordinated hunts that killed many animals at once. We know the steppe bison intimately because, like the mammoth and the rhino, the frozen ground has given us its body. There is a bison thawed from the Alaskan permafrost, tens of thousands of years old, so well preserved that scientists could determine not only its anatomy and its coat, but the manner of its death. The marks of the claws and teeth of a great lion, still readable on the mummified hide, recording the animal's final moments, the exact predator that killed it, across all that frozen time. A single death on the mammoth steppe, one lion and one bison, tens of thousands of years ago, preserved so completely that we can still read it, still see the marks, still reconstruct the last few minutes of a life on the frozen plain. The bison, like the reindeer and the horse, was hardy and abundant and adaptable enough that the lineage survived the thaw, reduced, driven to the edge, but not extinguished. The great bison herds that would later cover the plains of North America, and that were nearly wiped out in recent centuries and then pulled back from the brink, are the descendants of the steppe bison of the Ice Age, a surviving thread of the frozen world, the multitudinous grazer of the mammoth steppe, still here, still moving in herds across the last of the open grassland. And there was the giant deer, often called the Irish elk, though it was neither exclusively Irish nor an elk. It was a huge deer, standing over 2 meters at the shoulder, and it carried the largest antlers of any animal that has ever lived. A span of up to 3.5 meters, tip to tip, a rack of bones so enormous that it is difficult to imagine the animal carrying it. Those antlers were grown fresh and shed every single year. An almost unbelievable investment of the body's resources, grown and dropped annually, a display structure of staggering cost. The giant deer grazed the rich grasslands at the edges of the steppe, and its magnificent antlers, found in bogs and lake sediments, were among the first Ice Age fossils to astonish the people who found them. Each of these animals was a different solution to the same problem: how to be a large plant eater in a cold, open, grassy world. The mammoth solved it at giant size, with tusks and a trunk. The rhino solved it low to the ground, with a snowplow horn. The horse solved it with speed and endurance. The bison solved it in great defensive herds. The giant deer solved it at the richer margins, with size and spectacular display. Together they made up the grazing multitude of the mammoth steppe. Millions of large herbivores, cropping and trampling and fertilizing, maintaining the grassland that fed them, spread across the top of the world. And a community of grazers that large and that rich is a standing invitation. Where there are millions of large plant eaters, there will be predators built to hunt them. And the predators of the Ice Age were among the most magnificent and most frightening carnivores the world has ever produced. There is a group we should meet before we leave the grazers, because they were quieter than the mammoths and the lions, but just as important, and because they are the ones the Ice Age people depended on most: the reindeer and their kind. Reindeer, the same animal known in North America as caribou, were among the most numerous and most important animals of the whole frozen world. They were not giants. They were medium-sized deer, superbly adapted to the cold, with dense coats, broad hooves for walking on snow, and a remarkable ability to travel enormous distances in great migrating herds, following the seasons across the tundra and the steppe. Both males and females carried antlers, unusual among deer, and they could smell the lichen they fed on beneath the snow and dig down to reach it. For the human beings of the Ice Age, The reindeer was very often the difference between life and death. Where the mammoth was an occasional, dangerous, spectacular quarry, the reindeer was the staple. Hunted in great numbers at the seasonal migrations, when whole herds could be intercepted at river crossings and narrow passes. The reindeer gave meat and hides for clothing and shelter, and antler and bone for tools, and sinew for thread in reliable, renewable abundance. Whole human cultures of the Ice Age were built around the reindeer herds, following them, timing their year to the migrations, depending on them utterly. And the reindeer, unlike almost every other large animal of the frozen world, survived. They are still there, in the far north, still migrating in great herds across the tundra, still followed and depended upon by northern peoples as they were 20,000 years ago. When the mammoth steppe broke apart, the reindeer were flexible enough and hardy enough and mobile enough to follow the cold northward and hold on in the tundra that replaced it. Of all the animals the Ice Age hunters knew, the reindeer is the one that is still living the same life today, in the same cold, hunted by the descendants of the same people. It is a thread of the frozen world that was never cut, a living continuity running straight from the mammoth steppe to the Arctic of tonight. The great grazing herds of the mammoth steppe and of the colder grasslands to the south fed a community of predators to match them, and at the head of that community were the cats. And the Ice Age cats were unlike anything alive today. The most famous is the sabre-toothed cat, and it is worth being precise about it, because the popular image blurs several different animals together. The classic sabre-tooth of the Americas was a powerfully built cat, heavier and more muscular than a modern lion, with a relatively short tail and immensely strong forelimbs. And of course, the teeth, two enormous canine teeth in the upper jaw, curved, flattened, and up to 18 centimeters long, projecting down below the jaw even when the mouth was closed. Those teeth have puzzled and fascinated people since the first ones were dug up, because they are strange and they are fragile. A sabre this long and this flattened would snap if it were driven into struggling, bony prey the way a modern cat bites. So the sabre-tooth did not hunt like a modern cat. The current understanding is that it used its tremendously powerful forelimbs to wrestle large prey to the ground and hold it absolutely still, pinning it with sheer muscular strength, and then delivered a single, precise, killing bite to the throat or belly, driving those long sabres into soft tissue where they would not meet bone. It was a grappler and a stabber, not a runner and a snapper. It killed by strength and precision, holding its prey immobile and striking once. We know these animals unusually well because of one extraordinary place, a set of tar pits in what is now the middle of Los Angeles, where natural asphalt seeped to the surface for tens of thousands of years, trapping animals that wandered into it. A large grazer would become stuck. Its distress would attract predators. The predators would become stuck in turn, and the whole grim sequence was preserved, layer upon layer, producing one of the richest collections of Ice Age predators anywhere in the world. Thousands upon thousands of sabre-tooth bones have come out of those pits, and from them we know the animal's build, its injuries, its life, in remarkable detail, including healed injuries that suggest these cats may have lived in social groups, supporting wounded companions who could not have hunted alone. It's worth dwelling on the tar pits a little longer, because they are one of the great windows into the frozen world, and the story they tell is grim and vivid and unlike anything else. In what is now the middle of a great modern city, natural asphalt, thick, black, sticky tar, seeped up from deep underground for tens of thousands of years, collecting in shallow pools at the surface. In the warmth, the tar softened and became a trap. A large animal, crossing the landscape, would step into what looked like a puddle and find itself held, unable to pull free. And the more it struggled, the more firmly it was caught. And then the trap did something crueler. The trapped animal, bellowing in distress, became bait. Its cries and its struggles drew predators and scavengers from across the landscape. The sabre-tooths, the dire wolves, the great condors and vultures, the American lions, all converging on what looked like an easy meal, a large animal helplessly stuck and unable to defend itself. And the predators, wading in to feed, became trapped in turn. One trapped grazer might draw in a dozen predators, all of whom died with it. This is why the tar pits are so extraordinarily rich in predators, far richer than any normal landscape where predators are always vastly outnumbered by prey. The tar pits inverted the normal ratio because each trapped herbivore drew in many carnivores. The dire wolf and the sabre-tooth are among the most common animals in the pits, recovered in their thousands. A biased sample, an accident of the trap, but a priceless one, giving us more complete predators than anywhere else on Earth. And the bones tell stories. Sabre-tooth skeletons from the pits show terrible injuries, broken and healed bones, damaged hips, wounds that would have crippled the animal. And yet they healed, which means the injured cat survived for months or years after being hurt too badly to hunt. An animal that cannot hunt and yet survives is an animal that was fed by others. And so those healed injuries are read, by some, as evidence that the sabre-tooths lived in social groups, that they supported their injured, that there was something in them of the pride and the pack, of animals that did not simply abandon the wounded to die. We cannot be certain, but the broken and healed bones in the tar suggest that even among these fearsome predators, there may have been care. There was a second kind of sabre-tooth, less famous and in some ways stranger, the scimitar cats. Where the classic sabre-tooth was a heavy, muscular grappler, the scimitar cats were longer-legged, leaner, built more for running, with shorter, coarser-edged sabres. They seem to have been pursuit hunters of the open steppe, and there is a cave in North America packed with the remains of young mammoths, apparently dragged there by scimitar cats. A den littered with the bones of baby mammoths, the record of a specialist predator that hunted the young of the largest animal in its world. And there were the great lions, not sabre-tooths at all, but true lions, close relatives of the modern lion and larger. The cave lion ranged across the mammoth steppe of Europe and Asia, a huge cat, bigger than a modern African lion, that hunted the horses and the bison and the young of the larger animals. We know it not only from bones, but from the Ice Age people who lived alongside it and who drew it. There are cave paintings of lions, done by human hands 30,000 years ago, that capture the animal with such skill and such attention that you can see the artist knew it intimately. The intent expression, the powerful shoulders, the hunting posture. The people who painted those lions had watched them closely in life. And there are frozen cave lion cubs, thawed from the Siberian permafrost, tiny and perfect, that died in their den tens of thousands of years ago. In the Americas, there was a lion larger still. The American lion, one of the biggest cats that has ever lived, a giant predator of the southern grasslands that hunted the horses and bison and camels of the Ice Age Americas. Picture the cats of the frozen world, then. On the open steppe, the great cave lions hunting the horse herds. In the Americas, the heavy sabre-tooths wrestling ground sloths and bison to the ground and delivering their single killing bite, and the lean scimitar cats running down the young of mammoths and the giant American lion at the top of it all. A community of great cats as rich and as varied as the grazing herds that fed them. And every one of them, without exception, gone today. The sabre-tooth, that icon of the ancient world, vanished. The cave lion, painted so lovingly on the cave walls, vanished. The American lion vanished. Of all the magnificent cats of the Ice Age, not one survived the thaw. The cats were not the only hunters of the frozen world. Alongside them, and sometimes against them, moved the bears and the wolves. And the Ice Age produced, in both groups, animals larger and more formidable than any of their kind alive today. Begin with the cave bear, because it is one of the defining animals of the European Ice Age, and because its story is bound up with the caves that give it its name. The cave bear was a huge animal, larger than a modern brown bear, with a massive, domed skull and a heavy body. Despite its size and its fearsome appearance, it was very largely a plant-eater, its great flat molars built for grinding vegetation rather than shearing meat. It ate the plants of the cold grasslands and forests, built up its fat reserves through the brief, rich summer, and then, as the long winter closed in, it did what its diet and its climate demanded. It went into the caves, and it slept. And this is where the caves come in. Cave bears used caves for their winter hibernation, generation after generation, for tens of thousands of years. The same caves returned to again and again across enormous spans of time. And inevitably, some of them died there, in their sleep, through the long winters, and their bones accumulated. There are caves in Europe whose floors are carpeted with the bones of cave bears, the remains of thousands of individuals, built up over tens of thousands of years of animals coming into the dark to sleep and, sometimes, not waking. Whole caves full of the dead of a single species, a vast ossuary of sleeping bears, deep in the mountains of Ice Age Europe. The people of the time knew these caves and these bears intimately. They sheltered in the same caves. They sometimes competed with the bears for those shelters. And in the deep chambers, among the bear bones, human beings left their marks. Paintings, and in some places arrangements of bear skulls that suggest the animal held some meaning for them that we can no longer fully read. The cave bear and the Ice Age human shared the darkness of the same caves across the same winters for a very long time. Larger and far more frightening was the short-faced bear of the Americas, one of the largest carnivorous land mammals of the entire Ice Age. Standing on its hind legs, it could reach heights that are difficult to credit, well over 3 meters, and it had long legs built, unusually for a bear, for covering ground efficiently. Its build has led to long debate about how it lived, whether it was an active pursuit predator running down prey across the open country, or a supreme scavenger using its size and its long-distance traveling ability to dominate carcasses and drive other predators, even sabre-tooths, away from their kills. Either way, it was an animal of enormous size and power, one of the great carnivores of the Ice Age Americas, towering over the landscape it moved through. And there were the wolves, including one that has captured the imagination more than almost any other Ice Age animal, the dire wolf. The dire wolf was a real animal, and a formidable one. Heavier and more powerfully built than the modern gray wolf, with a stronger bite, built for taking down large prey. It ranged across the Americas in great numbers. The same tar pits that gave us the sabre-tooths have given us thousands upon thousands of dire wolves, more than almost any other animal, suggesting they came to trapped prey in packs and were trapped in turn. They hunted the horses and the bison and the young of the larger animals in coordinated packs across the grasslands of Ice Age America. Recent work has revealed something surprising about them. The dire wolf, despite its close resemblance to the gray wolf, was not as closely related to it as everyone had assumed. It was a distinct lineage, one that had evolved large size and pack hunting independently, a separate experiment in being a big social predator. And when the Ice Age ended, that lineage ended with it. The gray wolf, its smaller and more adaptable cousin, survived. The dire wolf did not. There is that pattern again. The same one that ran through the seas in the earlier journeys, and that runs through this whole story. The larger, more specialized, more impressive animal dies. The smaller, more adaptable, less impressive cousin survives. The dire wolf, the great pack hunter of Ice Age America, is gone. The ordinary gray wolf, less powerful and less specialized, is still out there tonight, hunting across the northern forests. Being the more magnificent animal is, once again, no protection at all. There is one more predator of the frozen skies we should not forget, because it hunted above the great herds, and it was enormous: the birds. The Ice Age had giant birds, and among the most spectacular were the great teratons, enormous vultures and condors, relatives of the birds that still soar over the Andes, but larger, some with wingspans reaching well over 3 meters, and the very largest of their kind, from further back in the age, with wingspans that may have approached 7 meters. They soared over the grasslands and the tar pits on the rising warm air, scanning the plain below for death, descending to feed on the carcasses of the great grazers, competing with the sabre-tooths and the dire wolves at the kills. Picture the sky of the frozen world with those birds in it. Great dark shapes wheeling high over the white plain, riding the wind, waiting for something to die. The condor that still soars over the mountains of South America is their surviving relative, a living remnant of the great scavenging birds of the Ice Age, still doing the same work in the same way, still scanning the ground from a great height for the dead. And there were eagles and great owls, and a whole community of birds that hunted the smaller animals of the steppe and the tundra. The hares and the lemmings and the ground squirrels, the small abundant life that fed the smaller predators underneath the drama of the giants. The frozen world was not only mammoths and lions, it was a complete ecosystem, layered from the smallest burrowing animal to the greatest mammoth, from the lemming beneath the snow to the giant condor wheeling in the enormous sky, and every layer fed the ones above and below it in the great cold machine of the mammoth steppe. When you picture that world, then picture the whole of it, top to bottom. The lemmings tunneling under the snow, the Arctic foxes hunting them, the hares and the owls that took them, the great herds of grazers, and the wolves and lions and cats that hunted the herds, and above it all, the giant birds, wheeling in the bright cold sky, waiting for the plain to feed them. A whole world, complete and full and balanced, from the frozen soil to the top of the enormous sky. So far we have stayed mostly in the north, on the mammoth steppe and the cold grasslands of Europe, Asia, and Northern America. But the Ice Age filled the whole world with giants, and some of the strangest of them lived in the warmer lands to the south. In South America above all, which for most of the age of mammals had been an island continent, cut off from the rest of the world, evolving its own extraordinary and independent menagerie. The most remarkable of the southern giants were the ground sloths. We know the sloth today as a small, slow, tree-dwelling animal hanging upside down in the rainforest canopy. But those tree sloths are the last dwindled survivors of a group that once included some of the largest land mammals of the Americas. The giant ground sloths were enormous, the biggest of them approaching the size of an elephant, several tons in weight, standing when reared up on their hind legs, perhaps 6 meters tall. They were not slow tree hangers, but massive, powerful, ground-dwelling browsers, walking on the sides of their feet because of their huge curved claws, reaching up into the trees to pull down branches or digging for roots, their bodies protected by a hide so tough that it was studded, in some species, with small bones embedded in the skin, a built-in armor under the fur. They ranged from South America, their homeland, all the way up into North America, one of the few groups to spread north when the continents joined. They were hunted by the sabre-tooths and the great bears, and they were among the animals the first American humans encountered. There are ground sloth remains that show signs of human hunting, and even, in some caves, preserved ground sloth dung, thousands of years old, from which we can read exactly what these vanished giants ate. Stranger still were the glyptodonts. Imagine an armadillo, and then imagine it grown to the size of a small car. That was a glyptodont, a giant armored mammal related to the armadillos, encased in a huge domed shell of bony plates, like a living dome of armor, several meters long, with an armored tail that in some species ended in a heavy, spiked club. They weighed as much as a small car, too. They trundled across the grasslands and woodlands of South America, grazing, protected inside their great bony domes from almost any predator. An entire animal built like a fortress, a mammal that had independently arrived at the same solution as a tortoise on a giant scale. The glyptodont's shell was so large and so complete that there is evidence the first human beings in the Americas sometimes used the empty shells for shelter, sheltering from the weather inside the bony dome of a dead giant. A house made from the armor of an animal the size of a car. It is one of the strange, vivid images of the Ice Age Americas, the meeting of the first people and the great southern giants. And there were more. There were giant armadillos and enormous flightless predatory birds in the earlier part of the age, and native South American hoofed mammals unlike anything elsewhere on Earth, and giant relatives of the capybara and toxodons. Big, rhinoceros-like grazers that Charles Darwin himself dug from the cliffs of South America and puzzled over. South America, isolated for so long, had evolved a whole independent world of large mammals, as strange in its way as the marine reptiles of the ancient seas, and the Ice Age was its last great flowering. Almost all of it is gone. The ground sloths, the glyptodonts, the giant armadillos, the toxodons. The entire spectacular megafauna of South America collapsed at the end of the Ice Age, more completely, in fact, than almost anywhere else on Earth. The continent that had evolved the strangest giants lost the most. Today, the little tree sloth hanging in the canopy and the armadillo trundling through the undergrowth are the small, surviving ghosts of a lost world of giants. The dwindled remnants of the ground sloths that stood 6 meters tall and the glyptodonts the size of cars. Let me give you a sense of scale for these animals, because the numbers slide past and the mind needs help holding them. A woolly mammoth stood around 3 meters at the shoulder and weighed perhaps 6 tons. 6 tons is the weight of a large truck. Picture a truck, and then picture it as a single warm living animal, walking through the snow, its coat swaying, its breath clouding, its tusks sweeping 4 meters of curved ivory ahead of it. That is one mammoth, and there were hundreds of thousands of them, spread across the top of the world. The giant deer carried antlers 3.5 meters across. Stand in a doorway. A standard door is about 2 meters wide. Now imagine antlers nearly twice that span, grown fresh every single year and carried on the head of a single deer. A rack of bone wider than a car is long, regrown annually, an almost unbelievable extravagance of the living body. The short-faced bear, reared up on its hind legs, could reach well over 3 meters, able to look down on a tall man standing on another tall man's shoulders. The ground sloth, reared up to browse, reached 6 meters, the height of a two-story house, several tons of muscle and claw and tough-studded hide. The sabre-toothed's killing teeth were 18 centimeters long, the length of your hand from wrist to fingertip, projecting down past the jaw, a pair of curved blades carried permanently in the animal's face. I give you these not to overwhelm, but to make them real, because the danger with a parade of extinct animals is that they become a list of measurements, and measurements do not fill the mind's eye or settle into dreams. These were not numbers. They were enormous, warm, living bodies, breathing in the cold, moving across the snow, each one as real and as present in its moment as you are in yours. The scale is not a fact about them. It is the first thing you would have felt, standing on the frozen plain as the great shapes moved past you through the falling snow. There is one animal on the Ice Age steppe we have not yet met, and it is the one that changes everything, because it is us. For the whole of the last Ice Age, human beings lived on this frozen world, not as visitors, not as observers, but as part of the ecosystem, one more large mammal on the grassland, hunting the same herds the lions hunted, sheltering in the same caves the bears used, surviving the same winters that killed everything unprepared. This is the thing that sets the Ice Age apart from the ancient seas and the deep prehistoric past. There was no one to see the mammoth steppe of 100 million years ago because there was no one at all. But the mammoth steppe of 20,000 years ago was seen. It was watched and known and remembered and drawn by people whose eyes were the same as ours, whose minds were the same as ours, who felt the cold and the fear and the wonder exactly as we would. They were us, anatomically modern humans, and for part of this story, their close cousins, the Neanderthals. People, in every sense, living in the frozen world by their wits and their hands and their fire. And surviving in that world was an extraordinary achievement, because a human being is a tropical animal. We have no fur. We have no natural insulation against real cold. A naked human being on the mammoth steppe in winter would die in hours. Everything that let people live in that world had to be made, invented, learned, built, and passed on. The Ice Age human survived not by being adapted to the cold, but by being clever enough to defeat it, and that cleverness is written all over the archaeological record. It's worth saying something about the Neanderthals, because they belong to this story, and because for a long stretch of the Ice Age in Europe, they, not our own kind, were the people of the cold. The Neanderthals were not our ancestors, but our cousins. A closely related human species that had lived in Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before our own kind arrived, and who were, in every meaningful sense, people. They were superbly adapted to the cold, more so than we are. Shorter and stockier than us, with broad, powerful, heavily muscled bodies that conserved heat, large noses that warmed and moistened the frozen air, and enormous physical strength. They had lived through many glacial cycles. They were, in a real sense, the specialists of the human world, built for the cold, adapted to it in their very bodies, the way the mammoth and the rhino were. And they were not the brutish cavemen of old imagination. They made sophisticated tools. They controlled fire. They hunted the great animals of the Ice Age at close range with heavy thrusting spears in a dangerous, physical, up-close style of hunting that left their skeletons marked with the healed injuries of a hard life. Injuries, tellingly, much like those of modern rodeo riders, the marks of grappling with large, dangerous animals. They cared for their sick and their injured, who survived wounds that would have meant death without help. They buried their dead. There is evidence they used pigment and feathers and made ornaments. They were people. And then, Around 40,000 years ago, our own kind spread into their world, and within a few thousand years, the Neanderthals were gone. Why is one of the great debated questions. Whether we outcompeted them, or absorbed them, or simply arrived as the climate turned against them, or some combination of all three. But they did not vanish entirely, in one sense. They interbred with our own ancestors, and their genes are still carried, in small amounts, by most people alive today outside of Africa. If you are of European or Asian descent, you carry a little of the Ice Age's cold-adapted people inside you, a genetic echo of the cousins who were there first. There is that pattern again, even among the humans. The Neanderthals were the specialists, perfectly cold-adapted, built for the frozen world in their very bodies. Our own kind were the generalists, lighter, less cold-adapted, but more flexible, more numerous, more inventive, able to live in many worlds. And when the frozen world grew unstable, it was the flexible generalist that came through and the cold-adapted specialist that fell. Even in our own family, in the deep past, the same law held. It was not the one best built for the world that was, but the one most able to change for the world that would be. Consider what they had to solve and what they did solve. They made clothing, not draped hides, but fitted, sewn garments, tailored to the body, layered for warmth. We know this because we find the tools, eyed needles, delicately made from bone, tens of thousands of years old, that can only have been used for sewing fine, fitted clothing. Someone sat by a fire in the Ice Age and threaded a bone needle and sewed warm clothes, because without them the cold would win. Tailoring is an Ice Age invention forced by the cold. They made fire and controlled it and built their lives around it. The hearth at the center of the shelter, the source of warmth and cooked food and light in the long dark, the thing that made the winter survivable. They built shelters, sometimes remarkable ones. On the treeless steppe, where there was no wood, they built huts out of mammoth bones. Great structures framed from the tusks and bones of mammoths, covered in hides, whole villages of them in places, the architecture of a world with no timber, built from the skeletons of the largest animal on the plain. They made sophisticated weapons, not just simple spears, but spear throwers that multiplied the force of a throw, and later the bow, and finally worked stone points and harpoons of bone and antler. They hunted the great herds, the horses, the bison, the reindeer, and the mammoths themselves, with planning and cooperation and deep knowledge of the animal's behavior. And they used every part of what they killed, the meat for food, the hides for clothing and shelter, the bones for tools and building, the fat for fuel and warmth. In a hard world, nothing was wasted. They were not primitive. That is the thing to understand. They were people of enormous skill and knowledge and adaptability, who had solved the problem of living in one of the harshest environments the planet has ever offered to a naked tropical ape, and solved it so well that they thrived there across tens of thousands of years, all around the frozen top of the world. And they made art. This is the part that reaches across the distance and takes you by the throat, because it is not survival. It is something more, something that tells you these were not merely clever animals, but people with inner lives as rich as our own. Deep in the caves of Ice Age Europe, by the light of small stone lamps burning animal fat, people painted. They painted the animals of their world. The horses, the bison, the lions, the woolly rhinoceros, the mammoth. On the walls of caves, sometimes deep underground, in chambers that could only be reached by long, difficult journeys through the dark. And they painted them not crudely, but with breathtaking skill, with an understanding of movement, of anatomy, of life, that no one has ever surpassed. The horses on the cave walls are alive. The lions are hunting. The mammoths move. Whoever painted them had watched these animals with total attention and loved them, or feared them, or both, enough to carry that vision deep into the earth and set it down on stone by firelight. It is worth spending a little more time inside the painted caves, because they are the closest we can come to standing beside an Ice Age human and seeing through their eyes, and because what they contain is stranger and more moving the closer you look. The caves were not homes. This is the first thing to understand. People did not generally live deep in the painted caves. They lived at the entrances, in the light, or out on the land. The paintings are often far inside, down long, difficult, dangerous passages in chambers that could only be reached by crawling and climbing through the dark, carrying a small, flickering lamp of burning fat. Someone chose to go there, into the deep earth, into total darkness, at real risk, specifically to paint. The act of painting was worth the journey into the dark. That tells you it mattered, that it was not decoration but something closer to ceremony, or meaning, or need. And what they painted was, overwhelmingly, the animals, not themselves. Human figures are rare, and usually crude when they appear, as though people were not the point. The point was the animals, the horses, the bison, the aurochs, the deer, the mammoths, the woolly rhinoceros, the great cave lions, rendered with a skill that can stop your breath. The anatomy exact, the movement caught, the life somehow present in lines drawn on stone by firelight tens of thousands of years ago. Some of the animals are drawn in ways that use the natural shape of the rock, a bulge in the wall becoming the swell of a bison's flank, the painting and the stone together making the animal seem to push out of the wall into the room. We do not know and cannot know exactly what it meant to them. Whether the paintings were part of hunting ritual, or religion, or storytelling, or the marking of important places, or something else entirely that we have no word for. The people who knew are gone, and they left the pictures but not the meaning. But we can see, unmistakably, that these animals mattered to them beyond food, that a person carried a lamp deep into the dangerous dark to set down the image of a mammoth or a lion with enormous care, and that they did this over and over in cave after cave across tens of thousands of years and thousands of kilometers. The frozen world had its own artists, and its own art made in the deep earth by firelight of the great animals that shared the world with the painters. And when you look at those horses, those lions, those mammoths on the cave walls, drawn by people who watched the living animals with their own eyes, you are looking at the frozen world seen through the eyes of the only witnesses who could ever tell us what it was like to be there. They could not write, but they could draw, and they drew what they saw, and across 30,000 years we can still see it. The animals of the Ice Age, rendered by the people of the Ice Age, alive on the walls of the dark. And they left their hands. In cave after cave, across the whole Ice Age world, people pressed their hands to the wall and blew pigment around them, leaving a stencil. The exact outline of a human hand, 30,000 years old, a person reaching out and saying, without words, I was here. I existed. Small hands, large hands, hands with a bent or missing finger, the hands of adults and the hands of children. You can put your own hand up beside one of those stencils and it matches. Across 30,000 years, across an entire vanished world, the hand fits. That is the thing about the Ice Age that the ancient seas can never give you. Someone was there. Someone stood in the cold and watched the mammoths cross the plain and went into the dark and painted them and pressed a hand to the wall. The frozen world was not only lived in, it was witnessed and mourned and remembered by people who were exactly like us and who left us, across all that time and all that ice, the outline of a hand. It is worth pausing on the depth of time between us and them because the Ice Age feels recent, and it is by the standards of this series. But recent still means something almost unimaginably far away in human terms. The height of the last Ice Age was around 20,000 years ago. Set that against the span of human memory. All of written history is about 5,000 years. The oldest pyramids are around 4,500 years old. The cave paintings, the horses and lions and mammoths on the walls, the pressed hands, are, many of them, 20, 30, even 40,000 years old. They are older than the pyramids by as much as the pyramids are old, several times over. When the last mammoths were dying on their Arctic island, 4,000 years ago, the cave paintings were already ancient. Already tens of thousands of years in the past, made by people as distant from the mammoth hunters of Egypt's age as those people are from us. The frozen world, in other words, is recent enough to touch and yet deep enough to swallow all of human history several times over. The people who painted the caves were exactly like us. Same minds, same hands, same eyes. And they lived unimaginably long ago in a world so different that its largest ecosystem no longer exists and its greatest animals are gone. Both things are true at once. They were us, and they are almost impossibly far away. That is the particular strangeness of the Ice Age, and it is worth holding as you drift. It is the most recent of all the lost worlds, the one closest to our own, the one that human beings actually lived in and witnessed and drew. And it is still so far away that everything in it, the mammoths, the great grassland, the cave lions, the people by their fires under the aurora, has passed almost entirely out of the world, leaving only bones and frozen flesh and painted walls and pressed hands, and the outline, across all that distance, of a hand that matches your own. Let me put the pieces together now and give you a single day in the frozen world. One ordinary winter's day on the Mammoth Steppe, 20,000 years ago, reconstructed as faithfully as everything we've gathered allows, so that you have one whole living scene to carry down into sleep. It is not fully dark, even in the deep of winter, but the sun sits low and pale and gives little warmth, sliding along near the horizon and casting long blue shadows across the snow. The sky is enormous and clear and cold, a hard pale blue fading to white near the ground. The land runs flat and open to the horizon in every direction. The vast grassland, buried now under snow, the dry tips of the grasses showing here and there where the wind has scoured the surface bare. The wind is constant, a low, steady presence, carrying fine snow in long streamers across the ground. It is bitterly, killingly cold. But the world is not empty, and it is not silent. A herd of mammoths moves slowly across the middle distance. A dozen of them, the great matriarch at the front, the young close in among the adults, their long coats swaying, their breath rising in clouds. They stop and sweep the snow aside with tusks and trunks and feed on the frozen grass beneath, unhurried, warm inside their coats, exactly where they are meant to be. Somewhere among them a calf presses close against its mother's flank, out of the wind. Nearby, a herd of horses paws through the snow. A group of bison stands with their backs to the wind, heads low, their breath freezing on their muzzles. In the distance, a woolly rhinoceros moves alone, sweeping its great flattened horn across the ground. The grazers are everywhere, spread across the white plain, dark shapes against the snow, cropping the buried grass, maintaining even now the grassland that feeds them. And they are watched. On a low rise, half hidden, a pride of cave lions lies still, pale against the snow, their eyes on the horse herd, waiting. Further off, a pack of wolves trots along a ridge line, testing the herds, looking for the weak, the old, the young. The predators are there, always there, moving at the edges of the herds, and the herds know it, and the whole slow dance of watching and being watched goes on across the frozen plain as it has for tens of thousands of years. And on another rise, downwind, are people. A small group of them, wrapped in fitted furs, still and patient, watching the same herds the lions watch. They have been tracking the horses for 2 days. Behind them, a walk away, is the camp. A shelter framed from mammoth bone and covered in hides, a thread of smoke rising from the hearth inside, where the rest of the group waits by the fire. The hunters watch and wait and plan, reading the herd exactly as the lions read it, because their lives depend on the same knowledge. None of them, not the mammoths, not the lions, not the people, knows that this world is temporary. To all of them, it is simply the world, the only world, vast and cold and full, stretching to the horizon in every direction, as it always has and, as far as any of them can know, always will. The mammoths feed, the lions watch, the wind blows the snow across the plain, the smoke rises from the mammoth bone hut, and the pale sun slides along the horizon, giving no warmth over the largest and richest and coldest world the planet has held in 1,000,000 years. Before we leave the frozen world for its ending, I want to give you one more quality of it, the strangest one to convey, because it is about the sky and the light, and it is easy to miss. The Ice Age world, for all its cold, was in many places not the gray, dim, overcast place we might imagine. It was often clear and dry and startlingly bright. The cold air held little moisture, which meant fewer clouds, and the sun, low in the sky, giving little warmth, nonetheless shone down through clear, dry air onto an endless white plain, and the light bounced back off the snow, doubling itself, filling the world with a hard, brilliant glare. The frozen world was, much of the time, a world of enormous skies and brilliant light, blue and white and dazzling, stretching flat and clear to a horizon impossibly far away. And the nights. In the deep cold, in the clear, dry air, the nights of the mammoth steppe would have been extraordinary. The stars uncountable, sharp, and close, with none of the haze or the light of the modern world to dim them, and often, in those high latitudes, the great silent curtains of the aurora moving across the sky, green and pale and shifting over the sleeping herds and the human fires. The people who lived there saw those skies every clear night of their lives. The blaze of stars, the northern lights, the enormous dark. And we can only guess what they made of them, though the care they took with their dead and their painted caves suggests they made a great deal of everything. Picture it as you drift. Not a gray, frozen wasteland, but a vast, bright world under an enormous sky. The white plain running flat to the horizon, the great animals moving across it in the low, golden light of a sun that gives no heat, the herds and the hunters small beneath a sky that is bigger than any sky you have ever stood under. And at night, the stars and the shifting lights over the dark plain and the banked fires and the sleeping mammoths. It was cold, and it was hard, and it was, by every indication, staggeringly beautiful. The most beautiful version, perhaps, of the world in the light and the cold and the enormous clean silence of it. Hold that. That is the frozen world at its height, on an ordinary winter's day, with everything in its place. Everything that comes next takes it away. But right now, it is all still here. The herds, the hunters, the great cats, the smoke, the endless white plain. Let that be the world you carry down into sleep. Not the ending, but this. The mammoths crossing the snow, and the people watching, warm by their fire, in a world that was theirs. Before we leave the living world for the thaw, hold one more time the strangeness of what we have been describing, because familiarity dulls it and it deserves to stay sharp. We have been describing a world that was, in its way, as alien as the ancient seas of the earlier journeys. And yet it was here, on the same continents we live on now, only 20,000 years ago. Walk out of your door and travel to the right place in the far north, and you would be standing where the mammoth steppe used to be. The ground is the same ground. The bones are still in it. And yet the world that stood there is as gone as the age of the dinosaurs. The grassland vanished, the giants extinct, the whole enormous living system dissolved into the tundra and the forest and the risen sea. That is the particular vertigo of the Ice Age. It is not far away in space. It is right here, under our feet, on our own continents. And it is not unimaginably far away in time. It is recent enough that people lived in it, that we have the flesh of its animals, that we can read the last minutes of a bison's life from its frozen hide. And yet it is completely gone. A world both near and utterly vanished, close enough to touch and yet as lost as anything in this whole series. The mammoth steppe ran under the sites of modern cities. The great herds crossed land that is now suburb and farmland and drowned seabed. The cave lions hunted where villages stand. It was all here, all recent, all real, and all gone, so thoroughly gone that its largest ecosystem has no living equivalent, and most of its animals exist now only as bones and frozen flesh and images on cave walls, near in space, near in time, and yet as lost as the ancient seas. That is the frozen world. Right here, just gone. Let that be part of what you carry down. Not a distant alien world, but this one. Our own continents, our own recent past, transformed almost beyond recognition, holding, just beneath its present surface, the buried remains of a colder, wilder, more crowded version of itself, full of giants that ended only yesterday in the long count of the earth. Every world in these journeys ends, and the frozen world ended not with an asteroid or a poisoning of the sea, but with something that sounds gentle and was, for the animals of the mammoth steppe, catastrophic. It ended with warmth. Before we leave the living world for the thaw, hold one more time the strangeness of what we have been describing, because familiarity dulls it, and it deserves to stay sharp. We have been describing a world that was, in its way, as alien as the ancient seas of the earlier journeys. And yet it was here, on the same continents we live on now, only 20,000 years ago. Walk out of your door and travel to the right place in the far north, and you would be standing where the mammoth steppe used to be. The ground is the same ground. The bones are still in it. And yet the world that stood there is as gone as the age of the dinosaurs. The grassland vanished, the giants extinct, the whole enormous living system dissolved into the tundra and the forest and the risen sea. That is the particular vertigo of the Ice Age. It is not far away in space. It is right here, under our feet, on our own continents. And it is not unimaginably far away in time. It is recent enough that people lived in it, that we have the flesh of its animals, that we can read the last minutes of a bison's life from its frozen hide. And yet it is completely gone. A world both near and utterly vanished, close enough to touch and yet as lost as anything in this whole series. The mammoth steppe ran under the sights of modern cities. The great herds crossed land that is now suburb and farmland and drowned seabed. The cave lions hunted where villages stand. It was all here, all recent, all real, and all gone, so thoroughly gone that its largest ecosystem has no living equivalent, and most of its animals exist now only as bones and frozen flesh and images on cave walls. Near in space, near in time, and yet as lost as the ancient seas. That is the frozen world, right here, just gone. Let that be part of what you carry down. Not a distant alien world, but this one. Our own continents, our own recent past, transformed almost beyond recognition, holding, just beneath its present surface, the buried remains of a colder, wilder, more crowded version of itself, full of giants that ended only yesterday in the long count of the earth, and then, slowly, the balance tipped. The long cycles that govern the ice ages, subtle, regular variations in the Earth's orbit and the tilt of its axis, which change how sunlight falls on the northern continents, swung back toward warmth. The sunlight falling on the northern ice increased. The great ice sheets, which had taken tens of thousands of years to build, began to melt. And once melting begins, it feeds itself. Ice is white and reflects sunlight back into space. The dark land and sea revealed beneath it absorb that sunlight and warm further, melting more ice, revealing more dark ground. Melting ice released carbon and other greenhouse gases that warmed the air further still. The world tipped out of the ice age over thousands of years in fits and starts, with cold snaps and reversals along the way, but in the main direction always toward warmth. The ice sheets retreated northward. The sea, fed by all that meltwater, began to rise. 120 meters, over thousands of years, drowning the land bridges, drowning the plains of the North Sea, cutting Britain off from Europe, separating Asia from America, redrawing the map back toward the shape we know. For the world as a whole, this was the birth of our own age. The warm, stable, interglacial world in which all of human civilization would later arise. But for the animals of the frozen world, it was the end of everything. Because the warmth did not simply make the mammoth steppe milder, it destroyed it. Remember what the mammoth steppe was: a cold, dry, grassy ecosystem maintained by its own grazing herds. Warmth and the increased moisture that came with it changed the vegetation. The dry grasses that had fed the mammoths and the horses and the bison gave way across enormous areas to wet tundra, boggy, mossy, soggy ground, and to expanding forests. The grassland that had wrapped around the top of the world, the largest ecosystem on Earth, broke apart and shrank and turned into landscapes that could not support the great grazing herds. And here the self-sustaining engine of the steppe ran in reverse and destroyed itself. The grassland had been maintained by the animals. As the climate thinned the herds, there were fewer animals to maintain the grassland. And as the grassland deteriorated, it could support still fewer animals. The loss of the animals and the loss of the land accelerated each other, each making the other worse, spiraling downward together. The garden, no longer tended, reverted, and the gardeners, with nothing left to eat, dwindled and died. Across a few thousand years, the great megafauna of the Ice Age collapsed. The woolly mammoth, the woolly rhinoceros, the giant deer, the cave lion, the cave bear, the sabre-tooths, the dire wolf, the ground sloths and glyptodonts of the south. One after another, across the whole world, the giants disappeared. The most dramatic loss of large animals since the asteroid killed the dinosaurs, and by far the most recent. The world lost its giants, almost all of them in the space of a few thousand years as the ice pulled back. There is a hard question that sits underneath this, and it deserves an honest answer because it is one of the most debated questions in all of this science. What actually killed the megafauna? Was it the warming and the loss of habitat? Or was it us? Because human beings were spreading across the world at exactly this time, reaching new continents, arriving in the Americas, spreading into every corner of the megafauna's range. And the extinctions often follow, suspiciously closely, the arrival of humans in each new place. And the animals that vanished were overwhelmingly the large ones, the slow-breeding ones, the ones a hunting people would target and a slow-reproducing population would struggle to replace. The honest answer is that it was almost certainly both working together, and that the balance was different in different places. The climate change stressed the megafauna, broke apart their habitat, and thinned their numbers, making them vulnerable. And human hunting, arriving into already stressed populations of large, slow-breeding animals, may have been the additional pressure that tipped many of them from decline into extinction. A slow-breeding giant can absorb some hunting or some habitat loss, but not both at once, pressing from both sides. Where the two came together, a changing climate and a spreading, capable, hunting humanity. The giants fell. It is not a comfortable conclusion, but it should not be a simple guilt either. The Ice Age hunters were not villains. They were people surviving in a hard world, doing what every animal does, taking what they could to live. But the pattern that begins here, human beings arriving and the largest animals vanishing soon after, is one that would repeat again and again all over the world, down to the present day. The end of the Ice Age is, among other things, the first chapter of a story that is still being written. The story of what happens to the great animals of the world when we arrive. There is a question worth asking directly, because it sits underneath the whole ending and it is one of the most argued over questions in this science. Why did the Great Extinction fall so unevenly across the world? Because it did. The pattern is strange and telling. In some places, the megafauna was almost entirely wiped out. In others, much of it survived. And the pattern lines up, uncomfortably, with the history of human arrival. In Africa, where humans and megafauna had evolved together over millions of years, where the great animals had grown up alongside us, learning to fear us as we grew slowly more dangerous, the megafauna very largely survived. Africa still has its elephants, its rhinos, its big cats, its great herds, the last place on Earth where something like the old abundance of large animals endures. The animals there had time to learn us, over millions of years, and so they were wary, and they survived. In the Americas and in Australia, by contrast, places humans reached late, arriving suddenly as fully capable hunters into a world of animals that had never seen anything like us. The megafauna was devastated, rapidly and almost completely. The animals there had no time to learn to fear us. They met us already expert, already armed, already deadly, and they had no evolved wariness to protect them. And they fell, fast, soon after we arrived. This is the pattern that makes so many scientists believe human hunting was a decisive factor, at least in those places. Not the only factor, but the one that tipped already stressed populations over the edge. Where animals had evolved alongside humans, and learned to fear them, they survived. Where humans arrived suddenly into naive populations, the animals were caught unprepared and did not. It is a sobering thought, and it carries all the way to the present. The animals that survived into our own age are, disproportionately, the ones that learned to fear us early enough. And the pattern that began at the end of the Ice Age, the great animals falling wherever humans newly arrived, did not end there. It continued onto island after island as humans spread across the last unpeopled corners of the world, and it is continuing still. The end of the frozen world was the first great chapter in a story about us and the large animals of the earth, and that story is not finished. We are still living inside it. The frozen world is gone. The mammoth steppe, the largest ecosystem on Earth, no longer exists anywhere. The great herds are gone, and the great predators and the giants of the South. But the ending, as in every one of these journeys, is not total. And what remains is worth gathering here at the end, before we let the cold world go. Some of the animals survived. Not the giants, but their smaller, tougher, more adaptable relatives. The horse survived. The wild horses of the steppe dwindled and nearly vanished, but the lineage came through and would later carry human beings and human history on its back. The bison survived, in reduced form, in the last fragments of grassland in North America and Europe, hunted almost to nothing in recent centuries and pulled back from the very edge. The reindeer, the muskox, the wolf, the brown bear, the Arctic fox, the cold-adapted survivors of the Ice Age are still out there, in the far north, living remnants of the frozen world, holding on in the cold places that are left. When you see a muskox standing shaggy and stolid against an Arctic wind, you are seeing a piece of the Ice Age that never ended, an animal still living the old life in the last of the cold. And the frozen ground still holds its dead. The permafrost of Siberia and Alaska is a vast natural archive, and it is still giving up its treasures. Mammoths, rhinos, lion cubs, horses, wolves, thawing out of the melting ground, some of them so perfectly preserved that scientists have recovered not just their bodies, but their blood, their hair, their stomach contents, and their intact cells. As the permafrost melts in the warming present, more of them are emerging, the frozen world handing up its own dead into our hands, complete, across tens of thousands of years. It's worth staying a moment longer with the frozen bodies, because they have given us something no other lost world can offer, and it raises a question that belongs to the present as much as the past. Because the preservation is so complete. Because we have not just mammoth bones, but mammoth flesh, mammoth hair, mammoth blood, and in some cases intact mammoth cells. Scientists have begun to ask whether the mammoth is truly, finally gone, or whether something of it might be brought back. The woolly mammoth's closest living relative, the Asian elephant, shares the overwhelming majority of its genetic code. The mammoth's own genome has been read in detail from the frozen specimens. And so there are serious efforts, now, to identify the specific genetic changes that made a mammoth a mammoth. The coat, the fat, the cold adaptation. And to edit them into elephant cells, to produce, if not a true mammoth, then something very like one, a cold-adapted elephant that could, in principle, walk the northern grasslands again. Whether this should be done, and whether it truly would be a mammoth or merely a hairy elephant wearing a mammoth's clothes, is a question people argue about with real feeling, and it is not one I'll try to settle tonight. But there is something remarkable in the mere fact that it is a question at all. No one asks whether we might bring back the ichthyosaur or the mosasaur or the great sea scorpion. They are too old, too gone. Their living substance vanished hundreds of millions of years ago. But the mammoth died so recently, and was preserved so well that it sits right at the edge of return. Close enough to touch, close enough to read, close enough that people can seriously wonder whether the frozen world might, in some small way, be thawed back into life. I mention it not to argue for it or against it, but because it captures something essential about the Ice Age and why it feels so different from the deeper past. The ancient seas are gone beyond any recovery. The frozen world is only just gone. So recently, so completely preserved, that it still seems to be almost within reach. Its greatest animal held in the frozen ground, its genome readable, its return imaginable. The mammoth is the most recently lost of all the great lost animals, and it shows. It is the one that got away most narrowly, the one whose door has only just closed, and perhaps has not entirely closed at all. There is a strange afterlife to the frozen world that is worth telling, because it connects that lost age to the ground we walk on, and even to the objects in our hands. For tens of thousands of years, mammoths and rhinos and all the great animals of the steppe lived and died, and their bones and their tusks accumulated in the frozen ground and the ancient riverbeds. And the tusks, above all, did not simply vanish. Ivory does not rot easily, and buried in the cold ground it can survive, intact, for tens of thousands of years. The frozen north holds, beneath its surface, an enormous quantity of mammoth ivory, the tusks of countless animals preserved in the permafrost, a buried treasure of the frozen world. And human beings have been digging it up and using it for a very long time. Mammoth ivory has been carved and traded for thousands of years, some of the oldest art in the world. Small carved figures, tens of thousands of years old, made by the Ice Age people themselves, is carved from mammoth ivory, the people of the frozen world making art from the tusks of the animals they lived among. And the trade never entirely stopped. Even today, in the warming north, as the permafrost melts, mammoth tusks emerge from the thawing ground and are gathered and traded. A commerce in the ivory of an animal that has been extinct for thousands of years, dug from the melting remains of its frozen world. So the frozen world is not entirely gone. It is in the ground of the far north, in the buried tusks and the frozen bodies. It is in the carved figures in museums, made from mammoth ivory by human hands 20,000 years ago. It is even, still, in trade, emerging from the thawing permafrost into the present day. The mammoth is extinct, gone for thousands of years, and yet its ivory is still coming out of the ground, still being held in human hands, a piece of the frozen world surfacing into the warm one, carried up out of the melting past. When you next see a small carved figure from the Ice Age in a museum, or a photograph of a mammoth tusk emerging from a Siberian riverbank, remember what you were looking at, a piece of the frozen world, surviving into ours, the physical substance of a vanished age, still here, still solid, still capable of being held. The great cold world reaching up out of the ground into the present, thousands of years after it ended. And there is one last mammoth story, and it is the strangest and the most haunting of all, and it is the right place to end. When you picture the woolly mammoth, you picture the deep Ice Age, the frozen world of 20,000 years ago, the age of the cave painters. And you imagine that when the Ice Age ended and the world warmed, the mammoths all died, and that was that, thousands of years before the pyramids, before writing, before recorded history. But it is not quite true. On a remote island in the Arctic Ocean, north of Siberia, a place called Wrangel Island, a small population of woolly mammoths survived. Cut off by the rising sea when the land bridge drowned, isolated on their island, they lived on, long after the mammoths of the mainland were gone. They lived on through the warming. They lived on as the great steppe vanished everywhere else. They lived on, this last little herd of the frozen world, on their island at the top of the world. And they were still alive 4,000 years ago. Sit with that. The last mammoths were alive when the pyramids of Egypt were already built. They were alive during the age of the great early civilizations, while people were writing, building cities, recording history, an entire world away. Somewhere in the human past that we think of as fully modern, the age of pharaohs and written words, there were still, on a cold island in the Arctic Sea, living woolly mammoths, sweeping the snow aside with their tusks, the very last survivors of the frozen world, holding on for thousands of years after everyone assumed they were gone. And then, around 4,000 years ago, the last of them died, alone on their island, unwitnessed, and the woolly mammoth was gone from the earth entirely. The frozen world, which had ended everywhere else thousands of years before, ended finally there on Wrangel Island, in silence, while human history was already well underway somewhere to the south. That is the true end of the Ice Age. Not a dramatic moment, not a catastrophe. Just the quiet death of the last small herd of a vanished world on an island at the top of the world, 4,000 years ago, long after the world had moved on and forgotten them. Let me put the whole shape of it down one more time, and then we'll stop. There was a frozen world, and it was the largest and coldest and richest version of the planet in 1,000,000 years. Ice sheets 3 kilometers thick lay over the north. The sea had drawn back 120 meters, and the land was swollen and joined in unfamiliar ways. And across the top of the world stretched a single vast grassland, the mammoth steppe, the biggest ecosystem the planet has held, cold and dry and open and full. On that grassland lived the giants. The woolly mammoth, warm in its great coat, sweeping the snow with its tusks, led by the old matriarch who held the herd's knowledge in her mind. The woolly rhinoceros with its snowplow horn. The horses and the bison and the giant deer with antlers 3 meters wide. The cave lions and the sabre-tooths and the great bears and the dire wolves that hunted them. And in the south, the strangest giants of all. The ground sloths the size of elephants, the glyptodonts the size of cars. And among them, watching them, hunting them, painting them, people. People exactly like us, who solved the cold with fire and fitted clothing and mammoth bone houses, who watched the herds cross the plain and went into the dark caves and set down, by firelight, the animals of their world, and pressed their hands to the stone and said, "I was here." Then the world warmed. The ice pulled back. The great grassland broke apart and turned to bog and forest, and the engine that had maintained it ran in reverse, and the giants fell. Most of them, all over the world, in a few thousand years, as the cold world melted away. And the last mammoths held on an island at the top of the world, until 4,000 years ago, when the very last of them died, and the frozen world was finally, completely over. None of it was permanent. None of it was building toward anything. Just ice and grass and giants and cold and people by a fire and a warming that took it all away. And, at the very end, a last small herd on an island, holding on long after the world had forgotten them. I keep returning to one idea tonight, and I want to state it plainly before we reach the end, because it is the deepest thing this frozen world has to teach, and it is easy to lose among the giants. Everything in that world was temporary, and nothing in it knew that. The mammoth had walked the steppe for hundreds of thousands of years, and did not know its world would end. The cave lion hunted the horse herds and did not know the herds would vanish. The people painted the animals on the cave walls with such care, such love, such attention, and they did not know they were painting a world that was already, even then, beginning to slip away. To all of them, it was simply the world, the only world, vast and cold and full, stretching to the horizon in every direction, as it always had and, as far as any of them could know, always would, and yet it ended. The warmth came, and the grassland broke apart, and the giants fell, and the world that had felt eternal to everything in it turned out to be just one more temporary arrangement of the earth, colder and richer than most, but temporary all the same, as temporary as the age of the dinosaurs' seas before it, as temporary as our own warm age will one day prove to be. There is nothing bleak in this, I think, though it can sound bleak. It is simply how the earth works and how it has always worked. Nothing is permanent. Everything is temporary. The frozen world was full and vast and beautiful, and the animals in it lived their whole lives without a shadow of its ending on them, and their lives were no less real, no less complete, no less worth living for being temporary. The mammoth crossing the snow was not diminished by the fact that its world would end. It was warm and alive, and exactly where it was meant to be, on an ordinary winter's day, in a world that was its own. That is not a tragedy. It is just how it goes, from age to age. The world filling with life, the life becoming magnificent, the conditions changing, most of it passing away, and something new beginning in the space it leaves. It happened before the frozen world, and it happened to the frozen world, and it will happen to ours. And in every one of those worlds, the animals lived their real and complete lives, needing no one to remember them, and it was enough that they were there at all. It is worth saying clearly what it meant that this was the first lost world with witnesses, because it changes the whole character of the ending, and it is the thing that sets the Ice Age apart from everything else in these journeys. Every other world we have visited ended unwitnessed. The ancient seas emptied and refilled with no eye to see it. The age of the dinosaurs' oceans ended in fire and dark, with nothing capable of understanding what was happening. Those were catastrophes without mourners. Enormous, complete, and unobserved, known to us only now, reconstructed from stone, hundreds of millions of years too late. But the frozen world ended in front of people. As the mammoths dwindled, human beings were there, watching. As the great herds thinned and the giants grew scarce, people saw it happen. Not as an abstraction, not as a chart, but as a lived reality, over generations. The animals their grandparents had hunted becoming rarer, then rare, then gone. The people who painted the mammoths on the cave walls were painting animals that were, even then, beginning to slip away. Somewhere, someone was among the last people to see a living mammoth on the mainland and did not know it, and there was no one to tell. We do not have their words. They could not write. But it is almost impossible not to imagine that the disappearance of the great animals was felt, and marked, and grieved, and remembered in story, passed down as the memory of a richer world that the ancestors had known, and that was now gone. The people of the frozen world watched their world end. They are the first mourners in this whole series, the first beings capable of understanding that something vast and irreplaceable was passing out of the world and of feeling its loss. There is something fitting and something heavy in that. The frozen world was the first lost world with witnesses, and the witnesses were us. We were there at the ending. We may even have been part of it, and we carried the memory forward, out of the Ice Age, and into the warm world that followed, down through all the generations, until at last we learned to read the bones and the ice and the painted walls, and to reconstruct the world our distant ancestors had watched disappear. The frozen world is the one lost age that human beings saw with their own eyes. And in reconstructing it now, we are, in a sense, remembering something our species has never entirely forgotten. So let your breathing slow now. Let your shoulders come down from your ears. Let your jaw loosen. Let the warmth of wherever you are settle over you, heavy and safe, and let it hold you completely. You don't need to remember any of this. That was never what it was for. The mammoths crossing the frozen plain did not need to be remembered, and for thousands of years they weren't. And it happened anyway, in full, every day, the great coats swaying, the tusks sweeping the snow, the calves pressed close against their mothers in the wind. If you drifted off somewhere out on the mammoth steppe, that's all right. It's still snowing there in the mind's eye. The herds are still crossing. They always were. Somewhere tonight, in the real far north, in the last of the cold, the part of the frozen world that never quite ended. A muskox is standing shaggy against the wind, and an Arctic fox is crossing the snow, and the permafrost is holding its mammoths in the dark, exactly as it has for tens of thousands of years. The frozen world is not entirely gone. It pulled back to the cold places and waited, and a little of it is still there tonight, in the dark and the snow, doing what it has always done. It doesn't need you awake for that. Sleep well. We'll go somewhere else next time.